In this episode of the Dorks, we're talking about one of our favorite subjects, and that is skid fabrication. We're talking with two of the best people, CJ Best and Pete Majeski, both of them bringing unique perspective on how to really establish skids within your business and scale them moving forward. It was a great conversation, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. And we're live and back with the Dorks. This time we're with Pete Majeski and CJ Best, and we're going to talk super skids. We're going to talk about fabrication and how the market has moved towards optimizing around modules and skids and how many we got to build ourselves, because it's always fun to talk about the ones that we actually got to build, right? But before we do that, Travis, did you decide to grab a drink today?
I did. I'm not doing like a full 75 like Trent, but I have pumped the brakes on my consumption a little bit. So I'm still working on that bottle of Jameson, but tonight I made it into an old fashioned. So gonna
Right
sip
on.
on an old fashioned with the Black Barrel Jameson. What about you, Jonathan?
I am solidly McAllen's. So I had my birthday and I got an awesome selection of scotches now. I got like McAllen's and I got Hakushu and I got an extra Lafroy. So I'm gonna do scotches for a while. And I like the Macallan 12. It's nice. It's smooth. Um, CJ, I'm gonna imagine, being that you're at work and you're with Trent, that you probably are going sort of alcohol free this evening.
Yeah, that's a pretty good assumption. I come in hot right off of a meeting, so I'm drinking good old H2O out of my MCA Fab water bottle here. So got to represent, but yeah, maybe a little later, but it's still only 3 o'clock.
There is the Mexican Coke over here and a bottle of Cholula that we can. If anybody wants to like donate to a Patreon, I'll drink the entire bottle of Cholula on camera. Or we can.
One quick show note. I don't have a shaker, and I was going to prepare a couple of old fashions, so I didn't have to sit here and do it during the show. These things really do pretty well as a shaker, like if you're in a pinch, a multi-drink shaker. So I've been collecting them obviously for a while, like a few of us, so they're helpful.
Duly noted. Yeah.
Pete, did you grab a drink today, or are you saying?
I did. No, I grabbed one. And actually, I'm going with a Frank August. It's a small batch. So if you have not heard of this or not tried it, highly recommended. The single barrel won either Bourbon of the Year last year or one of those, many of the ratings. So if you narrow it down to where for cigars, Cigar Aficionado has their top 25, I'll follow the Bourbon top 25s. And that's where I first heard of it, and was a Christmas gift. So I've been able to keep it through Q1, and it doesn't look like it's going to last too much longer.
Real quick, CJ, maybe start with you. Could you introduce yourself for anybody that doesn't know you out there? I know that we all know who you are, CJ, but could you introduce yourself just real quick to everybody?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm CJ Best, Director of Manufacturing at McKinstry. Been with the company for 11 years, and I oversee our production team and detailing teams and kind of work on construction kind of operations and continuous improvement efforts within the manufacturing space. So that's a super high level. We can get into it a lot more during the discussion, but I do all sorts of fun stuff.
And Pete, I know you were just on, but could you give us a brief background, especially a background about where you were at prior to Autodesk, kind of that fabrication part of your background?
Absolutely. So Pete Majeski. So I'm with Autodesk in the technical sales side of the org under the construction division. So day-to-day, very generalized perspective of the industry. So I get the luxury of being able to talk to a number of different aspects of the build side of the world and support on the software front. And I say it's a luxury to have that generalized perspective because many different market sectors, many different geos and mindsets and contractor types. So prior to joining Autodesk, I led prefab and modular delivery at a company named MC Dean out of Northern Virginia. And that's where I would say really honed in my passion and my exposure to the high complexity, mission critical build side of the industry. And prior to that, I was in healthcare for Gilbane out of the Mid Atlantic region. So I've always been in more of that super consolidated, heavy pipe and wire building systems environment. But what has really sparked my interest for it years ago was the complexity of not only the actual build and integrations piece of it, but just the whole life cycle to it between the owners, the owners reps, the supply chain, and all the various scopes that fall into it. So in terms of today's discussion, I'm excited to dig in and brain pick amongst all of us chickens here, but more importantly, see where we might differ in terms of perspectives or even just experience as it comes to different delivery methods for skids in today's environment.
And I was actually going to, Travis, I was actually going to ask you the first question. So
All right.
if we rewind to MCA Fab, we really rewind to when it was over at your shop, and they were looking at the first multi-trade racks. I think I remember them saying that you were trying it. It was the first time and you weren't sure if it was going to make money, but you thought it was going to at least break even. Was that the first time that you were involved with them also? Or had you been involved prior to sort of those builds? And do you remember how many years ago that was?
Well, it's more than 8 years ago because it's slightly before I even came on board. So I've
Oh,
only
really?
heard the stories from that period, but I can tell you, I don't have any hard facts or numbers, but I want to say, according to my memory, like it was one of those things, and I think it's in. I'll ask our two guests to riff on this a little bit too, but I think as far as if you're looking strict dollars wise, I think it actually lost money, but it made it up in other places like schedule certainty, install time, and that kind of stuff. So the it, and hopefully, I mean, I think it is something I think that's maybe held the multi-trade rack or the multi-trade a lot of the kind of the bigger offsite modular type stuff back is because if you just look at it from a dollars and cents and standpoint, a lot of times it's break even at best. But I think that again, I'll toss this to Pete. Maybe you could talk a little bit. You can't just look dollars and cents, right?
Absolutely. And also too, this is where I feel much more comfortable now being more of a neutral player in the industry when it comes to there's not a lot of competitor type conversations or where you think items are very close to your chest to reveal whether or not things make money or don't. I think that I for one think it's a fallacy to pitch it as an immediate cost savings. Because it depends on what your definition of cost is as it relates to is it scalability? So do you want to build widgets long term? In that case, it does have the huge potential to save money. But the most accurate way I like to describe it is cost certainty, to where you know exactly where your risk is. So it might not always mean that you have the exact projection of the dollar for the physicality of the assembly. That obviously comes with time. But if you were to map out where your risk is in the job, that's where you could totally overlay the financial aspect to say, we know that we've schedule certainty. And then the cost certainty piece is not going to be a matter of saying that it's saving money. It's a matter of where that delivery falls on schedule. So you're avoiding liquidated damages or locking in large purchase orders. So it's not always savings. It's more about schedule certainty and then the cost placement certainty with that.
Right. That's an important thing to remember. I mean, you really have to measure what matters on that because historically, and I think that some of the modular stuff has even lost a head of steam in the contractor world a little bit. And there are some reasons behind that. I mean, historically, contractors have always viewed labor as the risk to everything they've done. And the age old method was, I'll throw material at something to save labor, to minimize my risk in the labor market. And 20 years ago, that was a pretty good math equation in your favor. I mean, in today's world, that math equation is not the same. Material prices have gone up way more in kind than labor rates have. I mean, like labor rates are fairly unchanged in the world, but material is much higher. So I think that there's even a little bit of a little negative view around some of this stuff, even in that regard. So you do have to think about other aspects than just a dollar and cent measurement, because the dollar and cent measurement we know skids add material. We know doing stuff in here is more material than building it on site. So those numbers are now, I mean, you got to tell a better story today, I think, because if you're just looking at the numbers, the material prices, I'd almost argue like I might want to just throw labor at it instead of material now. I mean, that really is shifting. So
yeah, very true. That's a great way to articulate with it. I wanted to circle back to where when I throw out the word certainty, especially as it relates to cost certainty, a lot of times that's the immediate pushback where people say, well, it's not cost certainty. And again, there's a fluctuation between what budget may be for labor, material, and the offsite process. But the reason I like to acknowledge it as a cost certainty idea is because it's not just the building of the component that's important. It's the full life cycle of delivering the project. So although you're pulling a lot of cost and coordination and handling up front, if you were to scale out to the overall delivery of that project and treat that as cost certainty, you know where your risk falls and where those labor and resource peaks and valleys might be. So it seems counterintuitive to say it's not about the cost, but there's a cost certainty aspect. It's because it's part of the project delivery rather than just the manufacturing or fabrication aspect.
Yeah, that's well said, Pete. And I think, one of the trends we're seeing is like there's so many mega projects going on in the United States right now that there's a new factor of you just can't get enough local labor to be able to execute the job that as the way you would traditionally execute it. And so that's opening up a whole new realm of possibilities to provide kind of an off-site solution or a joint venture that traditionally would have just been done by the local mechanical in that city. And so we're just seeing tons of opportunity coming up because no one contractor, electrically, mechanically, et cetera, can take on a $250 or $300 million scope of work. And back to the risk point, Pete, right? Like it's kind of risky to take that on yourself. So kind of do a joint venture or work on an offsite, onsite kind of partnership piece to be able to execute on that project.
Well, to your point there, CJ, too, it's like, because you don't want to take on that risk, and it's not just that project, right? If you are a capable mechanical contractor in that area, and most areas have multiple mega projects going on, right? You're taking on that risk, so it probably is better to try to spread that out and to use some of the cost certainty type tools that Pete was talking about to try to manage that across multiple projects.
We're also seeing, though, in the mega projects, primarily those buildings or those structures aren't just, a hotel. They're something where you have a mechanism that you're actually building within it. A lot of the data centers, the industrial projects. We just did a fracking plant not too long ago up here, a cracker. And I think that does change the attitude towards prefab a lot. I know working for United Refining, you had to prefab, so you got very good at it because the hot work permits to even do work in those areas was sort of restrictive. And once you got used to it, I do think that Travis, I know now when Helm takes on a multi-trade rack, I know they're making money because they've done it enough that they built that. I felt like these mega projects, especially on the electrical side, as I've seen electrical contractors do like data centers, they're really getting to the point where they're dialing in, building huge components for these very mechanically dense spaces, and did anybody else start out there like sort of VDC and BIM just doing mechanical rooms, or was that like a trend at North when you were doing it, Trent?
Early on, that was kind of the low hanging fruit. I mean, you looked where some of the most value was, and I mean, the mechanical room was like the most densely populated labor hour portion, of a project. So you would argue that of all the areas of that job that would probably carry the highest risk, or, so that was like an easy place to kind of key in on early. So and it was a space that was ours. So it was kind of, I think you were able to dictate it more. So if you wanted to limp into the idea of doing more prefabrication and more like multi-trade stuff, those rooms were kind of the easier first step. You were less influenced by the second and third parties of the project in your mechanical room. It was kind of a space that was given to you. So a good place to learn, good place to to try and like hone your skills in and try to modularize and standardize what you can. It seemed like that was the one, and then the other big first step for us was hangers. Seemed like it was kind of the one that was like the low hanging fruit. I think that a lot of people don't understand that even just our hanging systems in the mechanical and plumbing world alone, like is like 35 to 40% of the labor. So
Exactly.
it's like I think there's people that don't understand that it's massive. So it seemed like maybe the easiest thing to try and optimize.
I think it's weird. I was watching people come into the industry now and look at doing prefab, and they're doing some of the things that were the most difficult for us to pull off. Like a coordinated corridor is actually a pain in the ass.
It is.
To figure out and get
difficult.
done. And the
They're packed
runouts
tight.
are
Yeah.
we prefabbed runouts when there were 3 pipes because we could get away with it on the Unistred and everything. But I'm not sure if that wasn't just us not wanting to have too many people on a floor, wanting to be able to hit it like an army of people. So but I'm watching the new contractors come in and they're doing a lot of that stuff that I would consider more difficult. And I just wondered, like, CJ, did your company focus originally on those like mechanically dense areas and then move into the rest of it? Or are they somebody again that kind of said, oh no, let's try to eat the whole elephant?
No, I think it was before I started. We've been prefabricating for many, many years, but I think we started in the mechanical realm, in those dense mechanical spaces, and really kind of just continued to expand that of like, hey, this actually worked pretty well. Let's now get that into the corridor and more of the distribution levels of a commercial high-rise building, for example. And we actually have like been swinging the pendulum back a little bit. Like we had a really big push a few years ago of like, hey, let's get everything through the shop. Nothing goes to the job site directly. It gets routed through. And that was a good, like, kind of test case theory. But then it was like, okay, that's maybe a little bit too far. Let's not try and pre-cut necessarily everything that's going in the wall because of late breaking changes or other things. And so it's easy enough for the field to route some of those components that we just weren't seeing the value that you see in a mechanical space, for example. And so I think there's always this like healthy balance of teams in the field just trying to get stuff done and not be waiting on a production environment or coordination schedule challenges, versus the other driving of like, hey, we have this large capital investment, we need to leverage it, and there's better ways or quicker ways to make certain types of joints, right?
Yeah.
Oh
yeah. And much of that is totally true on the electrical side as well, to where that pendulum swing to saying, hey, detail everything, prefab everything is a very easy mandate. So there's a beauty in that to say, okay, it takes the thinking out of whether or not there's a decision. It's just a matter of building a plan to facilitate that. The downside is that's typically where you get very sloppy with recording metrics or understanding what actually is of value to build offsite. So saying model everything, prefab everything is great in terms of strategy and direction. But after a few years of it, you'll have people scratching their heads, looking at each other, wondering where they're making money. And I think Travis's point too, to where when you have the aspect of, oh, you could tell they're making money because they're doing X, Y, or Z. There's also this theme that's happening right now to where companies are doing it as a labor alternative or just as a way to scale some of their project delivery. So it doesn't happen all at once. So it's not always a directly proportional relationship. But if you have a shop that needs to be sustained, so your labor isn't mirroring what the job site's doing, it might allow you to win a few smaller jobs or support a larger job. But that's where the coordination piece becomes a whole animal in its own, because you can't rely on a single 35-year superintendent that knows the job inside and out. You now need to take that brain and then pair it with a educated detailer and logistics arm that knows what the job needs, where it needs to go, and the overall sequencing, which is totally different than a shop environment.
There's a couple schools of thought there, and I don't really. I'm not even going to sit here and say that I know which one's right. I know what we chose, and like, the measurer in me would measure the productivity and figure out like what really worked in the shop and what didn't, and probably do like what CJ's saying. I would probably start peeling back the onion a little bit, be like, oh, okay, so there's the point of diminished return, right? All right, I'm going to come back a bit, but like, I also understand the thought to just blast through it and do it all, and I don't think that that's even the wrong answer. It's when you talk about your capital investment and staffing a shop, like it's a predictable workplace. And as a manager, like I want that same crew there in full capacity all the time. I mean, for the same reason that a hospital wants to operate at peak capacity, we found out that hospitals didn't have open beds during COVID time, right? Because it's like, hey, it's a business. They were running at capacity. Like everyone kind of got dumbfounded. Like, what do you mean they didn't just have rooms waiting for this disaster? Like, no, it's so I feel like that shop is the same way. Like we want those crews there. We don't want to lay them off. We don't want work to come down. So it's like, even if we know that maybe we're 10% less efficient at this one branch, like I want to feed my investment and work those channels. I don't know if that's wrong. I mean, there's a couple
the
of
manufacturing sector's been doing that for decades, right? I mean, that's how you drive down the price of those widgets, is you just push more widgets through that shop.
Yeah.
Yep. No, and actually, Trent, I love that wording too. To where it's not one way to skin a cat when it comes to which delivery mandates and those means and methods works for different folks. What I've learned to kind of hang my hat on is the idea of density, to where if you need to prioritize from an offsite return on investment, going after density rather than your scope and systems density, that is. So you could build 2,000 square foot MEP rooms if you wanted to, but if there's only 4 low voltage panels in it, I would argue that was a silly use of spend on logistics, framing, drywall, and all the labor that goes into it, when the actual scope of your original contract was for a few grand worth of panel can mounting and termination.
Yeah. And that's where my head usually is too. But when I think about what I'm saying is I don't know if the other end of that argument is necessarily wrong.
Yep.
Right.
I know historically I would have peeled that back, and I would have probably not taken the opportunity to perform that work. I would have let, my skilled field crews handle things that they proved to be more efficient at. But I also understand where somebody would decide to not go that way. It's
yeah, I mean, it's tricky. Like it comes down to the capacity planning piece, right? Like what does your demand forecast look like for your production environment, and peeling things back or pushing more, like doesn't happen overnight, right? Like there's a culture change. And so it's not like I can snap my fingers and all of a sudden there's a bunch more orders coming through of fab that was on the fence, right? It was like, hey, we might do this in the field because you detail it a certain way, you package it a certain way that's going to run through the kind of production system. Whereas if you're planning from the beginning to do it on site, because maybe your shop's full and you don't have a ton of capacity and you have to run it on second or third shift, then you may package it a different way than if you're running it through the normal system, or at least in our case, like the normal production run. So
that's a
good addition too. The detailer side of it, that's a whole nother good addition, because that was a whole nother department where contractors were like, I either need 5 or 500, and they hated staffing.
Right.
Early on, it was like they didn't want to. I remember the arguments. It was like, I don't want to, because we either need all of them or none of them, and it was that whole. So there's also that argument of just keep feeding them the work, because I can continue to expand them and put them to work in the channels that we agreed, that we wanted to do in our business.
Totally. And I've learned to appreciate that aspect on the shop floor. So not only is the staffing, so say from a VDC aspect, right? Like, do you need 500 or do you need 0, and the peaks and valleys there? But if you were to also look at every product line going through these facilities that are doing multi-trade. So, and I'll say multi-trade could also be what most folks would refer to as single trade, right? Because mechanical has your piping, right? So various types of piping, various sizes of piping, and the fittings, so forth. And so it's sheet metal, right? So I'd argue that between there, one scope mechanical is multi-trade already. Much the same, electrical is going to have various levels of distribution, pipe sizing, high voltage, medium voltage, low voltage, and so forth. But if you were to start walking through facilities and really look at the ways of what are they producing in widgets that's running on a shift cadence, so it's a matter of staffing shifts per week, you'll also be able to identify pretty quickly what the areas of investment for innovation are when you see that job shop type of feel, which I love acknowledging, especially if I'm doing a shop tour and I see something that seems, maybe not the cleanest, not the most automated, but that's probably where their bread and butter market sector of the future is, being that they want to get into larger skids, modules, or even the volumetric approach to where you see two different avenues of that large scale delivery. You have people that are very good at fitting out the box, that know how to do structures, but they don't know how to do systems. And then you have folks that are very good at doing the systems that need to learn how to build the box. So it's two main paths to modular and volumetric delivery, that it isn't rocket science. It's just a matter of which one makes sense regional based on available labor and expertise. And also there's that logistics aspect to where, do you really want to build something in Virginia and ship it across the country? Or do you want to set up shop temporarily near a fabricator and fit out the units there?
I think the other place where I saw prefab really sort of where you're in one of the other big unseen benefit of prefab, I have always thought was the level of planning required. Because, when I was an engineer, I drew drawings that I was pretty sure are not the way that building's going to get built. Like I drew drawings that kind of help somebody kind of know how to put it together, but you're not going to build the building that way. And when you're in VDC, you can get away with, if coordination is all you're doing, I'm just going to coordinate it, but that's not the way it's going to get built. If you're going to fabricate, that's the way it's going to get built. Like you have, if you're doing big pipe, you have an 1/8 inch, and that's, you're really happy when it's 4 inches pipe. So you have more like a 1/4 inch, but like that idea that we now need to plan a building at a level that buildings don't get planned I thought that was the biggest win. Like you throw out stuff into that wicked environment that is out in the job site, and yes, you can say, okay, I'm taking my measurements, I understand how things are working, except for when this event happens where like a truck breaks down or everybody is scheduled to be on the same floor at the same time, and your production numbers that you're using to measure whether your fabrication is good are set up against reality, which just happened to go bad that day for $20,000 to $30,000. You know what I mean? So I thought, I think the biggest change that I saw as people moved to fabrication was just this mindset of, we don't have to plan. We can leave that to that poor bastard in the field, to we now need to plan, and we're going to inflict it upon that poor bastard in the field. So we need to plan right.
It was contracting's introduction to Parkinson's law, right? It was kind of like, it kind of like showed what was really happening, where it was like the field crew, like, hey, we've got, field foreman Johnny, who's he'll catch all this. And, they knew that they had till that substantial completion date to get that stuff done, right? Now, all of a sudden there was this new mindset of, hey, our shop now actually wants to start doing what you were going to do out there 2 months earlier. And it was all of a sudden Parkinson's law set in, where it was, hey, my deadline just squeezed. And, people were now basically forced the industry to learn how to plan and front load work. So it's an interesting concept. I think it probably taught contractors how to plan better.
It turned all those VDC guys into PMs for a bit, while the PMs were figuring out what their job was, because I think their job fundamentally changed to be way more logistical, way more in the weeds on measurements and making sure these things came out. I think for a while, all of the VDC people were being directly engaged by the foreman, because the foremen are like, well, I need to get my stuff right. And you started to see that whole build piece break off from the PM again. I think it's turned back. I think the PMs have figured out what their job is, and I think their job is more logistical and directed.
Well, we've given them tools. We've given them tools to leverage that stuff now, right? I mean, I could do a shameless plug too, right? But
do a shameless plug.
I think tools like Stratus and other ones out there. I mean, there's definitely ways for other stakeholders in a company to, the VDC team isn't really the only person who holds the keys to that data anymore. So I think
kind of
that
want to turn
helps.
this planning piece into a question then to CJ and Pete. So one of the common themes that we would have where we operated as a mechanical contractor, which I will say is pretty unique because we kind of straddled a couple of different types of regions, right? We had the Chicago area, which you would say is probably pretty close to the coasts and being pretty progressive and forward thinking in the way that they were doing their contracting methods. And then we would have kind of the rest of the rural Midwest where you would have, you'd still have the, the plan and spec hard bid world, but
Pete's
we found a lot
drywall.
of,
Yeah.
yes, we found on a lot of instances where we thought that we had some opportunities for not even just like modularization or large prefab was, or large modulars or modular racks was, just fabrication is the lack of planning at the project level. But by the time it got to us to do our work, there was no way possible we were going to get a semi-sized corridor rack into the space, right? So CJ, I'll probably start with you then, because maybe you see from your particular market, like are owners or CMs or GCs, are they getting better at being forward thinking about that kind of stuff?
I think they are. I mean, I think there's definitely pockets across the U.S. where that's still a challenge and a huge barrier. But at least in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of the general contractors, CMs, owners we work with have kind of embraced the approach and recognized that, like, hey, we need to put in a production plan and like fabrication timeline to account for when this stuff's going to get installed. Like, it doesn't just magically show up on site one day. And I think it ties in a little bit to the topic I want to tie on, which is like the supply chain, right? And like managing the supply chain and how much construction is becoming kind of your ability to manage that. And so like one of the jobs we're doing right now, the challenge we're having, which you would have called me crazy a few years ago, is like our hardest part is getting equipment on time. Like the delivery dates keep pushing out. And so like back to your point on labor is more predictable right now, and equipment's becoming our larger risk. And so, that's putting some schedules at risk, or just making us, maybe we can still deliver on time, but it's causing us to work out of sequence within the production environment, right? So anyways.
Hey, CJ, on that, how transparent are those people being about those supply chain issues? Because we were talking about it with switchgear with a large group of people, and one of the biggest problems was they weren't telling the contractor we're going to be late. And so the contractor, like, if you tell us we're going to be late, we can staff differently, we can work on a different part, we can go to our fab shop and maybe just concentrate in there. So how transparent are you seeing people be with where your stuff is at any given moment? You know what I mean?
I think there's a lot of room for improvement in that arena. I mean, I think it's like, okay, but there's
nice.
like there's definitely some room, right? And it depends on like the vendors you're working with, the duration of time, and like the level of trust you have with them, right? But I think there's this balance you try and strike of like, on a certain project or a program that you're delivering, how many suppliers do you want to engage with to have to manage the like updates from maybe it's 6 suppliers versus going to only 2, but then you have higher risk of, if that supplier is not delivering, it's impacting a larger portion of your module, right? And so we're kind of working through like, what is that right balance to hedge your bets, but also be effective and achieve like bulk buyout pricing and volume discounts, right? So there's some work to do.
And it also goes to knowing what questions to ask. So everybody has a piece of the pie when it comes to the overall delivery of the project, right? So if you think about the end state, the owner is paying for a finished building, right? So tangible, something you flip the lights on and it's ready for occupancy. And as you back up all the way through the procurement steps, there's a sales operation and R&D and production and fab that happens at the component level that we treat like a purchase order, right? And I think if you know how to ask questions that go beyond the surface level vendor status report, that's where the transparency ultimately should be, because there's a scope of work that's owed to you as a customer there, but they're not going to volunteer information when it comes to production tracking or just overall status of the job. So I learned the hard way not to get your monthly vendor status reports, and just because everything was still green and not in that yellow or red phase yet, that it was okay. Learning how to have that open communication and dialogue to say, okay, we're going to come visit the facility when the stuff hits the line. Or maybe you have a full-time equivalent there that's helping QA, QC process if it's that high risk of a job. So if you have vendors that aren't willing to open their doors to do that, I'd say that might be something you might want to reconsider. Or more importantly, just understand that the whole transparency aspect within project delivery has drastically changed. And to tie that to the piece of planning, I think the idea of planning on the upfront aspects of the project have really just brought a lot of what was happening in the field and still continues happening in the field to the surface, because in the absence of a plan, one will be made. It's a matter of who is developing the plan. And that's not to say you don't want experienced folks in the field helping develop the plan, but they shouldn't have to be taking time away from their craft to account for the mishaps, miscommunication upstream. So it's quite the opposite. The folks who are installing ultimately end up being the best planners, or at least to Trent's point earlier with I think it was I interpret it as model hierarchy, but even in terms of just breaking out what elements are going through the fab shop and just basic work breakdown structure, it's the folks in the field who ultimately know how they want to build a job.
Yeah. Pete, I don't think any of this surprises. I mean, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't this a natural progression of any process iteration? I mean, I think that in our industry, we've stepped up our game in some areas, and all we're doing is we're just finding the next bottleneck. I mean, this is all process iteration. I mean, I think historically, where the rubber meets the road, the labor was kind of like seen as the bottleneck, and like now contractors are kind of moving some of that out of the job site into the shop, getting more efficient in areas. And now it's all these talks about, owner decisions and material lead times. And like, I think we've just put a spotlight on the new bottleneck. I mean, that's normal process iteration, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
It's not surprising.
Do you think some of it though is to do with the sort of the amount of money that's been pushed into the contracting market? We have the electrification of America on the electrical side. It's throwing huge amounts of money.
Yeah, it doesn't help, right?
Yeah, we don't have any materials or people
hurt
to build with. But like when you talk about that bottleneck, I feel like we were talking about the switch gear again and I was talking to somebody who was very knowledgeable, and he's like, listen, it wasn't that we ran out of stuff in COVID. It just happens that COVID coincided with this huge rise in demand. He said, we could have been perfectly healthy through that. You'd still see a problem with our supply chain because we flooded the market with money to build with and with infrastructure projects and everything else. So like, while I completely agree with you, definitely we're going through that iterative process. I wonder how much of like the growing pains we're seeing right now are top down. It's like there is so much money to be had if you can figure a way to build faster, cleaner, better.
Yeah.
It's
right,
a huge pot of money, dude.
Yeah, it totally. And even too, if you look at the overall trends to where, outside of agriculture, construction is the oldest industry, right? So, and I
Prostitution.
like
I thought that
Kind of.
was it.
so I would say that's more of a trade. I say
Oh, that's
it's
the
a trade,
trade.
right? Yeah,
That's
so
right.
that's not my first rodeo getting that as feedback. Trent. But it's what's so ironic is that if
Who had that message canned, dude? That was ready.
Tenure right there.
in terms of it being the tail on the dog, it's required for all the other industry and sector growth, right? So like data centers are the best example right now currently, to where every other tech sector that's trending, whether it's the AI and ML or overall cloud-based services, are rooted in this concept of easily accessible information in 24/7 systems. And the grid doesn't exist current state to support that. So right now there has to be money that goes in to support that build aspect of the industry, just to make everything that you're viewing on your screens and connecting remotely be able to work.
Yeah.
We're just digging our graves for the machines, right? That's what we're doing.
That's
We're all
right.
like,
But going back to like the models that play out again, I think the model that typically plays out is it gets smaller. Like Apple just bought, I can't remember the name of the company, but they bought an AI company. And the cool thing about the AI company was it was trying to do localized artificial intelligence. So instead of using a data center, it's trying to leverage local hardware. And, Apple does that. Apple likes having everything on your phone. But that idea, like, do you remember when I do. When we all signed into the local college that had the best servers because there were no like PCs were not going to accomplish anything. And I feel like that level of compute, we get into we get into technology that can compute at a much higher rate. I think that you'll see that those data centers, unfortunately, will become something that was a temporary need that
hmm,
that slowly sinks away. I can tell you there are
I
still
hope you're
rooms
right, but
over.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
I
It
I
seems like the amount of data we consume is just exponentially I don't know. It's an interesting thought. Somebody
I
smarter
just
than me in that space would have to answer that one.
I think that's a very interesting thought, and actually, we're going to need another hour and a half here to dive into that because that's such an interesting concept because when you think about it, it ties into other aspects that aren't related to data. And here's one: real estate. So the way that a lot of these co-locations and these hyperscale deployments are launched is because you're able to, it's cheaper to build a massive facility in a remote area, run utilities through it, and basically have control over that hyperscaler or that co-location, and then section off areas that you don't use is almost a real estate, right? So if you have a large hyperscale tech company that builds a data center, and if it's hyperscale, if it's all internal for them, right? And then it turns into co-location if they think they need most of it, but if they don't, they'll lease it out to other providers that are in need of it. If the real estate market were to change to where that consolidated or say even edge deployment makes it so that it's cheaper to renovate a high rise that's not being utilized downtown in some fashion, maybe that's the perfect niche market for what you're describing, Marsh, with that it's localized to where it's within regions, it's device specific, and it has certain hubs. So I would nerd out over that because when you go into
Well,
some of these facilities that are acres and acres, they're very impressive. But I wouldn't call it a single point of failure, but it's not as distributed as a decentralized means would be.
No, I have seen similar concepts what Jonathan's talked about, both from power distribution and compute. So, but I hadn't thought about it from the data standpoint because I always feel like there has to be some massive ass hard drive somewhere.
Yeah, it's just what was in my head, but maybe not. Yeah.
we have quantum computing coming, right? I mean, in theory, we have a new system of computing that's going to go
Said that
significantly
30 years
faster.
ago too. I don't know.
Yeah, but we had AI back in like what are we're working on?
This will be our
the-
AI talk again, where I got
yeah,
We also have
attacking
the,
2017.
me for being
the
the
singularity,
naysayer.
the extension of the human race as well. I mean,
Yeah, we don't need to go
so
extinct
skids.
anytime soon.
Super skids.
Oh, yeah.
And
Not just skids.
it all starts with skids before you.
So getting back on skids, so everybody's got to have at least one that they loved. I mean,
There's a pretty cool one right outside this door over here too. Yeah.
yeah, but
I don't think I'm
but
allowed to go out there
he's
and
not
film
allowed
it,
to
but
tell you about it. Is it pink, CJ?
it's
Did you
super.
color
It's a
pink?
super skid. It's
Yeah.
yeah. That's all I can say. CJ said that's all I can really talk about.
Well,
I think the funniest thing I saw was somebody who had a real problem because they had put in a 10-ton crane overhead and they were building skids that were now more than 10 tons. And they're like, this
That's
is the
an
best
interesting
problem that
point.
you can
That's
have.
a building limitation sometimes too.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
Best
I mean, it's
problem
a
you can have, but a
real.
big problem.
Yeah, I mean, as we, and part of the title, Super Skids, was like, hey, okay, so we maybe do a multi-trade rack here or there or some pump skids, but, when you get into the super skid space, you're integrating multiple skids together, have all the equipment on there, likely mechanical, electrical systems. And so, some of these things get up to 90,000 pounds, 120,000 pounds. And so it's not necessarily feasible to have a 60 or 70 ton overhead crane in your facility And so, working through, it becomes a big logistical challenge of what are the constraints that you can make? Where do you make these breakpoints? You want to get as dense as possible and kind of as big as what makes sense for the space to reduce the amount of interconnects on the job site. But at the same time, you got to be able to ship this skid to where it needs to go. And so, whether you have to use like bringing a mobile crane out on site and using skates to get it out of the building and then put it onto the oversized truck, right, and then get it down. Some of the stuff our team's having a lot of fun kind of working through and figuring out.
Do we have a definition for super skid? Do we want to like define? Yeah, I think we need to define it for the listeners. Like, what are we saying is a super skid?
What did you two come up with?
We'll come up with it right now because that's a great way.
Yeah, we got to do it right now. We got to do it live
for the industry. Yeah,
I really like CJ's thought there with the logistics, and just to take it a step further, it's specialized logistics. It's not a matter of just renting another forklift and crossing your fingers that it doesn't hit anything on the swing out of the parking lot. It turns into route surveys, extra coordination with the owners, GCs, potential road shutdowns. Multiple jurisdiction of sign off. If you're going across state lines, county lines, there might be, I've done ones that were rerouted through residential neighborhoods due to access to final job site locations. So it definitely would require a dedicated specialized logistics function. So it's I wouldn't say that it's always third party, but when you get into the specialty rigging and crane companies that are really doing this as a service, I'd say that might be an aspect of a prerequisite, and also overall systems complexity to where I would take it beyond this. And I say simple. It's not the most simple thing to mount a piece of equipment on a pad and transport it, but I would say it needs to go beyond the mounting aspect and go to interconnections between equipment. So if it's miscellaneous systems for hangers or overhead strut racks, ceiling grids, or the under skid piping to where your utility is being routed through piping that's welded in the skid well before that any of the actual fit out is happening. So I think that complexity comes forth through the interconnections more so than just moving equipment.
I would say that moving is a big, like for one of my things, the best skid, or not the best, the biggest super skid I ever saw was Bob Durr's skids they were up on giant tank treads. They were floated down a giant river. They were, and what I would say is the key thing was a lot of what he did was a one-off that's never going to be done again and was done in a superior manner. Like it was, I don't know, it's like 4-story skid.
It was incredible.
I mean, it looked like moving the space shuttle, for goodness sake. And that's what I think of when I think of super skids, is always go back to Durr's skids that he had to float down the creek. And honestly, even to a certain extent, the skid that's moving the space shuttle to its launch site, that's a super skid. It is a completely, it is a huge, it's a movable building, man.
Is that what's behind you, CJ? Do you have the space shuttle right now?
Are you building the space shuttle? Can you make it pink?
We got to log off here.
Super skids, man. I like it. So we're kind of defining it a little bit here. We're getting close.
So, if you had to say what is, because when you said it, I instantly thought of 2 or 3 skids I've seen. I saw a couple others on some electrical contractors who I probably shouldn't mention, so I'm not going to, but Durr's was a good one. Can you think of anything that sticks out to you, CJ or Pete, where you saw it and you're like, that is insanely impressive?
I mean, I saw some, and this is almost like even on a super level, but there was the YouTube video I was watching that was some like 6-story steel assemblies that had all of the mechanical electrical components getting floated over from China into, I think, like a oil and gas plant on the coast of Canada. And I was like, okay, now that's next level stuff, right? I mean, similar to your example, right, Jonathan? Like And I think the super skid piece, I think it does come down to the logistics aspect and how much planning has to go into it. You're not just going to throw it on a 53-foot flatbed truck and ship it down. And then Pete, I think you're spot on with the complexity and the interconnections between like two skids going together, right? On the job site, and how do you build those in your factory, ideally do factory testing, right, and actually run through commissioning before you're then decoupling it and shipping it to the job site. And so I think there might be an aspect of like the ability to factory test and how many systems you have integrated onto that to streamline the on-site commissioning process, right?
For sure. I like that. And I was going to circle back and bring up that the pre-commissioning and the full commissioning aspect of it, because that's where the biggest value comes into play. And that's the validation that it makes sense to build things in such a massive fashion. And Jonathan, I totally relate to your idea of jumping to the one-offs, because on a personal level, the most impressive builds, photos, discussions, and also the most sleepless nights have always been the one-off skids and modules. And I think it's for good purpose too. Not only is it because of the complexity of it, but if you look at pushing the boundary of what you need to do it to figure out if it makes sense. So one of mine, actually, you could research it, was the National Air and Space Museum, the electrical room there. It was 73 feet long, over 14 feet wide, and over 100,000 pounds. And we placed the concrete for the 4-inch slab in our facility. So if you were to draw out pros and cons and whether or not it made sense to plan that out, it's not something that I would say would make sense to offer as a service on every job. But in that particular application, it being a major renovation, it was the perfect means of delivery for allowing the pre-existing exhibition space to remain intact and essentially do a demo, full install, and startup and commissioning within a 2-week period, purely from that offsite aspect. So it was AISC certified steel, concrete placed, tested. So it was as complex as it gets in terms of not only the volumetric type aspect, including that structural component, but it had to tie to existing building structure. So coordination and planning, I wouldn't be able to stress enough on that one. But at the same time, I would not volunteer to do it again.
Yeah. I'm curious now, both of you, CJ, Pete, and anyone. So who, like on those examples there, who made the decision to do that super skid in the way that you did? I guess I'm wondering, is this a lot of times something that's dictated by the project or the project owner that you guys are performing for, or is this an internal decision you guys are making? I'm curious, like who's deciding to do these?
Take on this big scope. Yeah, I mean, for us, it's mainly been engagement with the owner early on, right? Because the amount of complexity and coordination that goes in, it's challenging to execute these super skids as we're defining them with the time frame that you're given, right, in a normal delivery model, even in the design build realm, depending on when you're on board. And so we're working with some pretty progressive owners, and some of them have already a program and they're saying, hey, we need you to go execute on this, like still vet through the design, but we have a pretty good idea of what we want to do. There's other owners that we're working with right now that they're saying, hey, we're super early on in design, help us develop the design for a manufacturing approach. And then we'll work with them on, providing some of those components. And then they'll probably have 2-3 other suppliers that can provide for campuses across the US, right? To Pete's point earlier, like you don't necessarily want to ship stuff all the way across the US if it doesn't make sense. So
yeah, that's go ahead, Pete.
I was going to say internal for me as well in that particular case, to where there was owner support by all means, but it was an internal decision with a number of different stakeholders. But ultimately, just to take some of the genius thinking out of it, it was almost a matter of scope creep when you think about it, to where we knew that we loved building modular electrical rooms, right? Which was essentially a miscellaneous steel package for its end use, but it was structural steel in terms of the packaging and logistics, right? So there's still stamps, there's still weldments and things that get signed off, but it's not part of the true structure of the building. So the initial thought was, okay, well, this steel might need to be structural. So let's call up our fabricators and partners. Hey, can you do this? Are you certified? Yes. Okay, no problem. We took that on. And then when we go in through some of the other alternatives to say, oh, well, hey, there's no way around this placed concrete slab, that needs to be part of the module. It's like, okay, well, we're already committed to doing it. What does it take, for us to like? Can we still make it happen? So I boil it down to the idea of scope creep, to where some of it was it wasn't all volunteer, to where we took on other scope and paid for it all out of pocket. There was a lot of support from the other trade contractors, but it truly was this abstract idea of wanting to scale our complexity and having it line up so that it made the most sense for all stakeholders, owner included.
I gotta say, I think when you talk about how you end up with that, I think it's when you have an owner that's willing to give away some autonomy for some results. It's like, I need you to build me this, and I'm going to give you very few rules in doing it. When I was screwing around with the biodiesel plant in Brooklyn, they got to the point where they stopped giving us layout drawings and just give us PNIDs, because they're like, well, you guys are pretty elegant in what you're putting together anyways. You have an aesthetic for understanding where a pipe goes, which I think is hilarious, because our best foreman, you can tell when they did a skid, because it's so much more elegant than the guy that's just worked in the VDC shop his entire life. Like they have just a better, it's almost like they have a better overall, like they can look at it and go, no, the pipe should be tighter. This should be left or right.
Right.
But those owners that say you have the freedom to do almost whatever you want, but this is the outcome I need. I see, like, when I hear the backstories of a lot of those bigger skids, that's what it sounds like. It's the owner comes to you and it's like, I'm going to do something that no one else has ever done because it's hard. And because of that, you're going to need some freedom. And that freedom for us is often, a little bit of a lottery ticket. If you do it right, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think as a mechanical contractor too, historically, there's a lot of MEP contractors out there that aren't even ready for that autonomy. I mean, that thing that you talked about right there, Pete, takes a project management team inside of that was a project in a project, right? And I think contractors in the competitive space of where project managers are competing for who has the most revenue they're running and competing, that method doesn't really, you're not ready for that autonomy. I don't think. No, that's a whole nother management team.
Totally true. I remember a 3-day period during that time. It was October 2019 was the start through December. There were 3 days in between that project while it was at the facility physically, to where I remember essentially having to take a crash course on concrete, to where we were going through, we took on scope to make sure it was the right PSI, that the tests and everything that fell in between it, to where it was definitely outside of my wheelhouse and outside the wheelhouse of many others. But the best thing to do was call the concrete guy on the job and say, hey, I need your help. And can you teach me, the surface level information of what I need to help coordinate here to make sure that it's in accordance to the job and everything we committed to collectively as a team. Because even though it was at our facility, it was truly an extension of a lot of the trades from the job site that had either direct involvement or were there as a support arm to say, we're doing this here and we will integrate it at 2 a.m. during its delivery in DC.
Awesome. I wanted to touch on something. I had two thoughts. First, CJ, you were talking about watching that video from China or whatever with the big thing. We all have a mutual friend that would refer to that as fab porn, just so you're aware. Like,
yeah.
But you were in
the oldest trade.
The oldest trade. This also touches on something you said when you're looking at these big super skids, and this is something that Helma's doing. Is like, we've done this here, we've done this here, we've done this here. When do maybe not the super skid, but when do large portions of these skids that we're all doing, when do they become products? And what's the process that you've thought about doing that, going through with that?
That's what CJ
Yeah.
wanted to ask everybody.
Yeah, no, that's a super good question, Travis, because we've had a lot of discussions internally about when does it make sense to go through the full product development effort, because it's not easy, and there's some upfront costs, there's resources in terms of dollars and human capital to go through that development process and decide how much do you want to be configurable versus kind of customizable, right? And I think when you take that product approach, you're really trying to say, hey, these are the configuration bounds that you have, customer. And so, we at McKinstry have, we have a sister company called Overcast that is a product manufacturer. And that was kind of born out of a necessity that we saw in the marketplace. But relative to like the role that I play and the purview that I have, we're still in the realm of, hey, we're going to provide the custom solutions for owners and general contractors right now. And, I think we've got our eye on like, when does that make sense? But I don't know if I have an answer for you right now, Travis, of like, hey, it needs to be X dollars of revenue or this much repeatability. I think we're still trying to find that, like, where does it really pay off to have that product approach?
I'll interject real quick, and then I want to hear Pete's thoughts. But like from Helm, when we were looking at the product approach, it was because we had a very niche market, right? We were doing a very specific thing for a handful of contract types and contractors across the country that did a very special. So then it made sense to build products around what we were kind of repeatedly doing for them anyway. Pete, have you seen a lot of it?
I think it's a matter of definition. So there's folks, and I'll use one everyone will, I'm sure, will smirk at, but the idea of product catalog. There's a lot of companies that claim that they have a catalog of products, but it's all schematic designs that are intended to be engineered to order. So I think the idea of product, for me, if I had to paint a hard line for it, I want to treat that as a SKU number that maybe has some different configurations, but that's it, right? I think the heart of a lot of the specialty MEP work is truly based in engineered to order systems, especially for the mission critical environment. Now, that being said, if you were to really break out something as a product, it's easy to replicate the build every time, right? Because that's just a matter of standard work and processes and bills of material. But if you were to take it to where fundamentally, even from a certification standpoint, it is a product, that's where it might be worthwhile to look at the UL listings and different certifications, or just overall state compliance based on where it's acknowledged as a product in a component, which gets you out of a few different scenarios. Because if you could sell it as a component and ship it as a component, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to have a build for others approach to where you're selling it truly as a product. But at the end of the day, I think that the sacrifice there is, if your goal is to standardize and productize, I would venture to say that you're going to limit your ability to do a lot of very complex, headache-ridden one-offs that are engineering heavy. So the idea of productizing would be your engineering is done on the front end to where it's scalable and replicatable from a manufacturing aspect. I, for one, don't like calling them products. I would call it a product line if it's a widget that you can drag and drop in a cart and pick a delivery date. I have really become accustomed to the idea of value stream as the way I like to describe it, because it shows the customization and configurability to an engineered to order system to say, okay, our value stream is more based on process and the people and skill sets. We don't care what color it is. We don't care if it's 7 inches longer or 7 inches shorter. And if we need to add a emergency power off switch due to compliance in Iowa, we can do so. So I like the idea of value stream more so than product when it comes to the semantics of breaking the two out.
Yep. You can't do it until you have the ability to tell your customer what their options are.
Yeah.
Henry Ford said it. you can have it however you want as long as the color's black, right? I
Black.
mean, it's like, yeah. I just don't think this industry can do it until we have the ability to tell
Well,
our customer what
one with art
they're
industry
getting.
too, then you need to produce something that the engineers will then specify, right? To choose from, right? And that takes even more work.
Very true.
I think just to throw a concept out there, I think what I saw in software really moves over into construction in this area well, because Agile says you try to get an MVP, repeatable MVP that needs developed. So your MVP goes out and you get feedback, and that leads to more development. I think that we can develop not necessarily end products because of the complexity and the one-off nature of a lot of what we do, but I think we could do repeatable MVPs. So we could say we can make 80% of this skid in a way in which we've made 20 other skids, 40 other skids, 100 other skids. And we'll automate around just building it up to that 80% mark. And then the last piece will be our iteration piece, will be all of those things, like you said, Pete, it's going in Florida instead of in New York City.
Yeah.
It actually needs a level of iteration that's just about that. But I feel like for some reason, and I think it's because construction is all waterfall. I feel like we don't like that idea of we will actually tell you that our product is an 80% product that needs customized by you. Um, and I think when more and more people cross over from software, I think you may see that change. But that's when I talked to some dude out of Canada when I was in Nova Scotia, and he was trying to do that with his shop where he had 80% water softening skids. So he had a bunch of water softening skids, all at 80%. You come in, you give it that final little bit, and he adds the final little bit and shoots it out his door. And it was honestly, Trent, it's like how General Motors beat Ford, right? Is they said, no, you can have it in 8 different colors, but we only have 8 colors.
Yeah.
It's like a little bit of customization. Maybe we get the market
So
on.
don't productize the super skid, but productize the components,
Yeah,
you need
exactly.
to peel back. Your expectation has to peel back a little bit.
Yes.
Very
yes,
true.
yes.
And the real reason you don't have a lot of super skids that are productized goes back to the supply chain aspect, the equipment vendors. So when you have concepts that are detailed out to be equipment agnostic, one of the many ways I've heard to it is referred. It sounds great, right? So if you were going to build a scalable mission critical program based on the idea of the gear being interchangeable, why would you not, right? That would be the perfect standardization and way to productize an aspect of the industry to where everybody could have a consolidated supply chain, ease of purchasing and delivery and integration. But if you go back to that component specialty, right? So those equipment manufacturers, you're going to enter and create a huge commodity-based pricing war because now everyone has to build the same thing. So if you really think about who has control of the productization in the super skid industry, it's the equipment manufacturers, because they would be putting themselves at a deficit to all have the same window access or use the same lugs or have the same bus bar configurations. So there is proprietary design and delivery on the component front that has existed for decades that we view as construction being the problem solvers with. Construction is the integrator. A lot of those big equipment manufacturers build their own skids, but that's not how our end users integrate them, right? So you might use supplier A for your transformers, supplier B for your bus duct, supplier C for all your chillers. Same thing on the generator front. So to say that the generator aspect. So if I use the generator analogy, right, to say that, hey, there's only certain subsets of generators and that's how construction should be, I think is erroneous in certain ways, because a generator is a component and construction delivers the whole system. So if we were only building components, you could productize. We're delivering systems.
Very much agree with that. The switch gear, going back to that again, they really talked about that also. They said we're really selling ourselves on these high levels of customization, these extras that we do. And if you want us to be able to deliver on time, we got to stop doing all that. Like you have to give us a break, and we have to be able to make our switchgear the same way every time.
Right.
And they know that they're not going to be able to sell that, based maybe on the Henry Ford principle, is not everybody wants a black car. I do definitely want a black car, but not everybody does.
It shows too
And
much
I
dirt.
think that
Salt.
I live in the cold, man. I just want my car not to be frozen all the damn time. But going back to, so we talked about super skids as the really huge, massive thing. Have you guys ever seen something where you said that's just elegant enough that it should always be done that way? That's the skid. Like I remember looking at some of the stuff Elwell was building up in his area, and he had basically, I looked at it, he had a pile of building. I'm just going to call it a pile of building. They were all on their little trays, ready to go out the door. He had a pile that equated to a building. And it wasn't that I was impressed by what was there, because it wasn't a lot of components. I was impressed by how elegant it was put together, stored, and would inevitably be deployed. So like, to what extent, and this is my last question, because we are kind of starting to get up there, not quite there, but to what extent do you think the level of elegance in the design weighs into these super skids? I mean, is it core, or is it just side note?
I think the design's a key aspect to being able to execute on them. Like, if you don't have a design that is incorporating into delivering these types of skids, for example, if we're trying to deliver a mechanical skid and the electrical distribution is in a entirely different room, like the amount of work you have to go through to change that, to say, hey, we want to work together with the electrical trade partner, or maybe McKinstry's doing an electrical piece, like it's almost just like a non-starter, because they've already coordinated up to a certain point, right? And so, the ability to like get in early, influence that design, and work with that design team to develop those elegant solutions, Jonathan, to support kind of the super skid model, is super important.
Totally agreed with that. And I think the other piece that it makes a phenomenal impact with would be the internal teams. So if you think of the idea of standardization, in having a product, I wouldn't say that it necessarily needs to be that you have a hard printed page as a product catalog and that's the only thing you sell. I think that design aspect really goes back to the team who's going to see multiple iterations, maybe across different clients, that knows how to look at that one line or knows how to look at that master equipment list and say, okay, I've seen these before. Here's how we configured it last time. Let's use that as our benchmark and then tweak it. Those are the skids that are the most that stand out as the most capable of being scaled, or the most beautiful works of art when it comes to saying, oh, I don't think I would do it any other way. For me, it's I've seen some awesome chiller skids from a mechanical front with that had a few other systems integrated. And then on the electrical front, medium voltage gear seems to be the most unimpressive visual in terms of, it's a skid with a bunch of boxy enclosures, right? So it doesn't look like it's the most complex. But for some reason in the electrical world, landing the medium voltage conductors is the hardest thing to find labor wise, because nobody wants to screw it up. So I view that as a no-brainer in the offsite world, to say, hey, if you have expertise with installing and landing medium voltage gear, do it offsite and put it on a truck. Don't worry about having a guy who's been doing it for 40 years drive around, multiple states in his pickup truck, landing wire at the beginning of the week and figuring out if he, and you have to call him on a Thursday to figure out if he's available Friday morning. That for me is a no-brainer in terms of, let's figure out how to capture that in your factory.
Nice. Excuse me. I like the elegance idea, because I think that a lot of our trade workers, like, they still take great pride in that, right? They love the beauty of the systems they installed. So how do we integrate that into this mindset? I think my last question, you two met at a conference and we're talking about putting this all together, what haven't we touched on yet? What haven't we hit in this conversation that got you so fired up? Start with you, Pete.
I think it's, and I'll share a personal perspective on it now, especially, getting a broader perspective on the industry. What is so refreshing for me is realizing that at the end of the day, everyone's building the same shit. And it takes part of the specialness away from having everybody hold things close to their chest and think they have proprietary knowledge with what they're building and they're deploying, because there's certainly a respect and privacy that needs to be upheld with every client in every particular market sector, and even contractor, means of what they're sharing and what they're openly showing others what they do. But there's only so many gear manufacturers that you can pick from. There's only so many wire and pipe and fittings manufacturers out there. So if you look at all the ingredients of what goes into these builds, there's just different logos and different colored hard hats that are building and integrating it. So what really sparked my conversation, and when we spoke at length back in Orlando some weeks ago, it's almost just, you get the little tidbits of, oh yeah, we have this type of job coming up. Oh, it's in this region, and this is the type of job. And then I'm like thinking through, oh, I've built a couple of those. So it's almost like we're guessing back and forth of what type of jobs and what type of delivery we're speaking about. And that's where the whole idea of the super skids really comes in for me, to be that it's not so much of a competitive market against the contractors versus the owners, or the contractors versus the suppliers. It's all one life cycle. And I think the people who really figure out how to maximize their presence in the industry are the ones who know how to admit what they don't know how to do, but also learn how to take the risk of pulling on more expertise, to say, hey, you know what, we're not structural experts, but we're going to take on a little bit of scope that includes that and see if we can get a little bit better. So for me, that was the pivot in my perspective with the industry conversations, especially with what CJ and his team are up to now, because it just shows that there's folks that are hungry to do more and take on that might today be a little bit outside of a wheelhouse. And I'm not referring to CJ and his team by any means, but just in general. But you fast forward 12 months and that's a totally new value stream or business unit for a company.
Awesome. CJ?
Yeah, Travis. I mean, I think like the super exciting thing for me is especially in the industrial and mission critical space, just with the amount of money flowing in the market, like the amount of demand and volume there is, like, I don't know if it's ever existed in both of those markets at one time in the United States, at least. And so, what you're seeing is opportunities for a few different players kind of converging on the market to fill this huge demand for these hyperscalers, co-locators, in large, industrial plants. And so you see, like, you have like kind of the middle of the road modular builders that have been doing this for 20 or 30 years or whatever, but they're booked out through the next 2, 3, 4 years. And so, you also have equipment manufacturers that are starting to try and scale out their skid capabilities and integrating multiple systems. And then you also have the MEP contractors coming at this space too of, hey, we've done this work, on the job site. We have fabrication facilities. We could actually provide a pretty good turnkey solution for these owners. And so it'll be interesting to me to see like how the market develops over the next 3 to 5 years, and how it may branch out into other verticals, right? Like we're seeing it a ton in industrial mission critical, but as you get a larger wave of suppliers that can execute on these type of super skids, like it may become more feasible in the healthcare industry, or maybe for venues or some other vertical that didn't want to go through the growing pains because they didn't have the volume of cash to put up front initially, right?
No, that's excellent. Jonathan, you wanna wrap us up?
Yeah, I guess it's about that time. I think when we when you guys called me up, it was right after Pete was on. And Pete, that last podcast, you kind of dropped the mic on a lot of the logistical realities that come into play when you decide you wanted to start doing prefab. And I think that's the only thing that I would ask sort of as we're signing off is, could both of you give me an idea just really fast of how critical it is to find the people that actually know what's going to be required to do fabrication? Because I'm watching a bunch of people stub their face on job after job after job where they decided, hey, we understand how to build and therefore we're going to be good fabricators, but they don't understand all of that other logistical constraint. Just real quick, kind of to close us out, what do you think that person or that manpower need is going to look like over the next 6-12 months as we're all sort of quickly trying to take advantage of all that money that CJ, you realize is sitting there in the market waiting to be picked up?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've been doing is we actually have taken some of our best planners from the field and brought them into the office, so to speak, in like a build planning capacity, right? So people that have been out in the industry, turn wrenches, put together ductwork, etc. And now we're having them in working with our project management teams, engineers, detailers, talking through like, no, that's a terrible idea because I can't get in to do X, Y, and Z. Here's how I would do it instead. And they're like, oh, I would have never thought to do it like that. And so, I think we're going to start seeing kind of a transition of some of the like labor leaders moving into more supply chain type planning efforts and design and supply chain, right? Because a lot of your top skilled general foremen and so forth, like they're really good at planning logistics and coordinating items to a job site. I mean, that's kind of what their role is on the job, to get everything coordinated to make sure their crews are ready to go and execute on the job and factor through or navigate through any changes in schedule, and things are very dynamic. And so I think you're going to see some of those folks continue to migrate into more planning roles and less like directly overseeing labor on the job site.
Yeah,
Pete, final thoughts?
That's nail on the head with what CJ was expressing there. I think even again, like my personal view on it, I've learned more from the 35-year and 40-year superintendents I've crossed paths with than I have on any PowerPoint conference talk or classroom setting. And I think that if the contractors and companies and different teams realize that it's those brains that need to be on the planning aspect, they might be a little bit rougher than what comes from a college environment or folks that sit behind a computer all day, but they're the brains behind the planning. And then my consolidated way of saying all that would be that if you look at the expertise that comes from different market sectors, whether it's manufacturing, lean experts, automotive, software, I think that people should be wary of folks that come in day one with too many flash drives from their previous jobs, like false information, and say, hey, what we do here is special. And it takes a certain type of person to be humble to realize that and go through it. That the drag and drops from previous industries and the terminology and the phrasing might apply and it might be helpful, but it is not the answer for what we're trying to do.
That is the perfect answer to leave it on. And we will see you next time on the podcast. This has been episode 80, the Super Skid podcast.
All right, gentlemen. As always, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, see you guys.
Thank you.